saw you got
Mhm. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun, have a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand. True to our God, true to our native land.
Hello. I'd like to begin reading the Emancipation Proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September, AD 1862, among other things, the following to wit, that on the first day of January, AD 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority, therefore, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do no acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States. And the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, AD 1863, and in accordance with my purpose so to do, publicly proclaim for the full period of 100 days from the first day above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, La Fourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the naval and military authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believe to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. General Order number 3. Official. Headquarters, District of Texas, Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865. General Orders number 3. The people are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. By order of Major General Granger, F.W. Emory, Major and Acting Adjutant General, signed. Thank you.
Should America celebrate Juneteenth Day? American school children have been taught that President Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves on January 1, 1863. However, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only declared free slaves in the rebel states. There were 15 slave-holding states in January 1863. The proclamation applied to the 10 states that were in rebellion, the 10 states that were fighting a bloody war against the Lincoln-led government in Washington. Therefore, Lincoln's proclamation had to be enforced by the military. Slaves in the rebel states were freed when federal authority was reestablished in those rebellious states by military force. and African Americans played a major role in the military victory that resulted in their own liberation. African Americans who celebrate Juneteenth Day implicitly embrace the idea that the slaves were freed on January 1, 1863, without any effort of their own. Why do these celebrants accept as truth an inaccurate description of their own ancestors as inert recipients of freedom? Most of them value the importance of knowing their history. Would they continue to celebrate Juneteenth if they knew their history? And why don't they know their history? In a 1935 essay entitled The Propaganda of History, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that influential European American scholars falsified the history of the Civil War in order to suppress the fact that the United States government, the Union, quote, had to call in the black men to save the Union, abolish slavery, and establish democracy, close quote. The success of the propaganda campaign that Du Bois identified resonates today in the attempts to make Juneteenth Day, June 19th, a national holiday. Over 30 states have made June 19th a state holiday, representing a major victory for the historians, or rather the propagandists, who deliberately falsified Civil War history to make African Americans appear to be inert recipients of freedom who did nothing to free themselves. The National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, NJOF, under the leadership of Ronald V. Myers, aggressively seeks to make June 19th a national holiday. Announcing that Nevada had become the 39th state to establish June 19th as a state holiday, NJOF explained the significance of Juneteenth. In this news release dated May 11th, 2011, the explanation reads, Juneteenth recognizes the day, June 19th, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, to read General Order Number 3, announcing all slaves are free through the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. It took over 2.5 years for the news to reach Southwest Texas, the last geographic area in America where slavery was practiced, creating the oldest African American freedom celebration and America's second Independence Day. Let us closely examine the veracity of this statement and show how it lacks historical accuracy, and that its lack of historical accuracy aligns almost perfectly with the propaganda, or simply the lies, of those who have sought to suppress the history of how Americans of African descent freed themselves while saving the Union. NJOF states, it took over 2.5 years for the news of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to reach Southwest Texas. Clearly implied is that the enslaved in Southwest Texas were doing nothing to free themselves between January 1863 and June 1865. And clearly advanced is the description of the Negroes in Texas as woefully ignorant of events related to the bloody national debate. NJOF's statement is perfectly aligned with the deliberate lie of W.E. Woodward when he wrote, quote, the American Negroes are the only people in the history of the world, so far as I know, that ever became free without any effort of their own, close quote. To state that slaves in Texas did not get the news that they were freed until June 19th, 1865, when Granger announced all slaves are free, is to assert that slaves in Texas and in all the states where the Emancipation Proclamation applied were freed without any effort of their own. Also, NJOF purports that Southwest Texas was the last geographic area in America where slavery was practiced, and that slavery came to an end there when General Granger read his order in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865. Galveston, however, is not in Southwest Texas. It is in Southeast Texas. The Union Army, under General Nathaniel P. Banks, captured Brownsville, Texas, which is in Southwest Texas, in November 1863. 5 African descent regiments took part in this Union victory that resulted in the Union Army occupying the southwestern tip of Texas for the duration of the war. These African American regiments became a part of the Union's occupation force in Southwest Texas from 1863 to 1865 and the end of the war. Another notable error in the NJOF press release is the claim that Southwest Texas was the last geographic area in America where slavery was practiced. Kentucky, Delaware, 12 parishes in Louisiana, and 7 counties in Virginia that were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation were, in fact, the last geographic areas in America where slavery was practiced. In these geographic areas, slavery did not come to an end officially until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. NJOF also claims that Juneteenth is the oldest African American freedom celebration. However, based on events during the Civil War, Emancipation Day in the District of Columbia, April 16, 1862, was the first African American freedom celebration. Therefore, the oldest such celebration related to the Civil War. Without an appreciation of the facts related to emancipation, Ronald Myers and his foundation continues to lobby in hopes of establishing Juneteenth Day as a national holiday. The foundation's premise for Juneteenth is clearly false. The official explanation of the historical significance of the day is fictitious. Therefore, Myers and his foundation are attempting to legitimize false history. Unwittingly, this African American organization is suppressing the empowering story of how Americans of African descent freed themselves while saving the Union. This African American foundation enthusiastically makes it appear that African Americans are the only people in the history of the world that ever became free without any effort of their own. Myers and his foundation perpetuate the false assertions of Woodward and others who have sought to conceal the accurate story. Woodward was clearly a propagandist who lacked integrity, and Ronald Myers, as president of the NJOF, is unwittingly a Woodward disciple. The truth is that African Americans played a critical role in their own liberation, and this story needs to be told and celebrated. African American soldiers were instrumental in the Union Army gaining a stronghold in Southwest Texas in 1863. In capturing Charleston, South Carolina, the cradle of secession, on February 18, 1865. In capturing Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, on April 3, 1865. And in driving the Confederate governor of Texas and his army out of Texas into Mexico on June 15, 1865, 4 days before Granger arrived in Galveston. Without knowledge of such historical facts, thousands of conscious African Americans celebrate Juneteenth Day. Knowledge of the successful efforts of victorious African American freedom fighters in the Civil War compels us to reject the history presented by Woodward and his unwitting disciples. Conscious men such as Myers are victims of a very successful propaganda campaign and are apparently unaware of the facts. Section 2 of the Nevada legislation calls on educators to advance the false statement that the last slaves in the United States were emancipated on June 19, 1865. Consequently, a lie has become law in Nevada. How has this happened in 39 states when the accurate history is easily accessible? It has happened because the propaganda campaign identified by Du Bois was successful in miseducating many conscious African Americans And these African Americans have successfully institutionalized a lie that suppresses the accomplishments of their own ancestors. Du Bois wrote in his 1935 essay, The Propaganda of History, quote, "One has but to read the debates in Congress and state papers from Abraham Lincoln down to know that the decisive action which ended the Civil War was the emancipation and arming of the black slave. That, as Lincoln said, without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. The freemen, far from being the inert recipients of freedom at the hands of philanthropists, furnished 200,000 soldiers in the Civil War who took part in nearly 200 battles and skirmishes, and in addition, perhaps 300,000 others as effective laborers and helpers. The victims, the miseducated, must be made aware of the truth. And after being exposed to the truth, they should cease and desist from advancing Woodward's lie by celebrating Juneteenth as the day when the last slaves were set free by someone in Washington. Certainly, informed and knowledgeable people should not celebrate the suppression of their own history. Juneteenth Day is a de facto celebration of such suppression. Americans, especially Americans of African descent, should not celebrate when the enslaved were freed by someone else, because that's not the accurate story. They should celebrate when the enslaved freed themselves by saving the Union. Such freedmen were heroes, not spectators, and their story is currently being suppressed by the advocates of the Juneteenth national holiday. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. It made it legal for this disenfranchised, enslaved population to free themselves while maintaining the supremacy of the Constitution and preserving the Union. They became the heroes of the Republic. It is as Lincoln said, without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. That's worth celebrating. That's worth telling the story of how Americans of African descent helped save the Union and freed themselves. Let's celebrate the truth, a glorious history, a story of a glorious march to liberty. Thank you.
So we just wanted to take a couple of questions. I know that was some new information, and so we wanted to see if anyone wanted to ask a question, needed some clarification. Mr. Gibbs will be here to address some of those questions. I don't see any questions. I think most are expressing their enjoyment of the presentation. Every time I hear Harry make a presentation, I am always enlightened, and I can see from all of you that that is the case as well. So I think we'll just move on to the next, to Richelle and her next song.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you so much for having me. I participated in the very first Juneteenth celebration in Charlottesville, so this always is an emotional and wonderful experience for me. The first video that you're going to see, I recorded with my cousin T. Ames, and we thought that in light of now 23 days of protesting, as well as in honor of all of the African Americans that have been killed by brutality, whether it be by police or vigilantes, this first song was appropriate, and it is entitled "Another Man Done Gone." Another man done gone. Another man done gone. Another man done gone from the county farm. Another man done gone. I don't know where he's gone. I don't know where he's gone. I don't know where he's gone. Don't know where he's gone. Don't know where he's gone. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his name. Didn't know his name. Didn't know his name. They killed another man.
It looks like we have a question from Carrie Kistler Murphy. Is the recognition of Juneteenth by companies and states positive progress or continuation of the propaganda that Harry shared? Mr. Gibbs, do you want to respond, or?
Sure. We walk a delicate balance with that. We want Juneteenth recognized, but we want it recognized accurately. The General Order number 3 applied only to Texas. And we're not saying that it's an either or proposition. If you want to celebrate, for example, DC Emancipation, which is even older than Juneteenth, then by all means do so. But we want to make sure that there is a deep enough body of knowledge out there so that people can make accurate, intelligent choices.
Another question, what's the best way to celebrate Juneteenth?
At the family dinner table. This is the kind of thing that needs to be spread best family by family, genealogy group by genealogy group. We need to put it on a personal basis. This is actually, Juneteenth is in many ways not only a general history of a people, but an intimate history of a people. When Juneteenth, before the 20th century, was celebrated, they took pains to make sure that history was held aloft. For example, in many Juneteenth posters, they would say that we invite all the old ex-slaves to come. Well, what does that mean? Because they were aware that the history, personal history, accurately transmitted by the people who lived through that history, would stand as a testament for the coming generation and generations beyond as that story was passed down. So it was very much a family affair, rooted in the church. And there was also an aspect that we wanted to let you know about Black progress, so that oftentimes Juneteenth celebrations in Texas were held at what at the time was called on land owned and controlled by colored people. Because the nature of hatred toward Black people in Texas was so intense, because the opportunities for advancement were so few, and those that existed were hewn out of a mountain of racial prejudice, Black people had to share with each other any signs of advancement. They couldn't call upon the state apparatus to ensure their own lives, their own property. We know in a new book, Cult of Glory, about the Texas Rangers, that between 1865 and 1930, the Texas Rangers refused to investigate the lynchings of more than 400 people, primarily African Americans. So against that backdrop, Juneteenth became an act of resistance. And all of this had to be brought through families interacting with families down through the generations.
Will someone speak more to current thought, feelings about Juneteenth celebrated locally as a state and local holiday for the first time in light of the lecture we just saw? I can, Mr. Gibbs, I'm gonna wanna jump in on that one. I think that, in light of the lecture that we just saw, the work that has been happening by African-American historians largely is to really begin to reorganize or create spaces for narratives that many of us have known for quite some time. I don't think anything in the lecture that we just saw suggests that we should not be celebrating Juneteenth. It just lets us understand that that African American soldiers, African Americans, were involved in their own freedom, and so that as we think of Juneteenth as people waiting to be freed, the fact of the matter is that that is not the case. And as we move forward, we should be highlighting that fact forcefully. Mr. Gibbs, how would you respond?
I would understand. I knew Harry. He and I talked about these matters. When in listening to you speak just a moment ago, I'm reminded about the various ways, quite ingenious, that Black folk took it upon themselves to stay knowledgeable about the progress of the war. Want to give our listeners and viewers one example that they can go look up. There's a wonderful book by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, one of the early great writers and poets of the Black struggle. It's called Iola Leroy. And in the first chapter, it has mysteries of market speech. And it gives wonderful examples of the kind of code that African Americans used in order to keep each other apprised of the tide of battle. When you understand that, we had our own internal telegraph, similar to what we used to let each other know about the Underground Railroad, and there was an Underground Railroad in Texas. I'm looking at an ad for a runaway youngster in Texas. These things remind us that we did not wait. We were not frozen in amber like some prehistoric insect unable to move, that we were constantly working toward our freedom by any means necessary.
There's a question from that says, what resources can you share with us so that we can continue to spread more information about the Black Union soldiers? And how do we begin to correct this misinformation?
One of the things that you can do is to look for books about the United States colored troops. For example, the Sable Arm by Dudley Cornish. You can also read Black Regulars, which takes place a little bit after the Civil War, but goes into Black Union soldiers were also part of the occupation forces in Texas after the Civil War. All of that needs to be known. So the Black Regulars by Doback, the Sable Arm by Cornish. I myself have written a book on the first Black regiment from the nation's capital that fought in the Civil War called Black, Copper, and Bright. These are like Men of War by Noah Andre Trudeau. These are fine testaments to the still hidden history of Black participation in the Civil War.
And I'm also want to hold this up. This is the book that I'm actually reading now. It's a book by Elizabeth Barron from the Now Center. So locally, they've just put up a new website that you can go and check out their information. They have identified as many as 250 local enslaved people who walked off the plantation to join the military to affect their own freedom. So that website, they just published that right around Liberty and Freedom Day. So that's a local source that we can look to.
If I can add, it was only last Sunday that a evangelical megachurch pastor said in Atlanta said that slavery was a blessing. Well, we know that's not true. It wasn't a blessing to white Americans and it wasn't a blessing to Black Americans, but it is a reminder of how much work remains to be done about uncovering the hidden history of Black involvement in the War of Rebellion and Liberation, which helped save this country.
So I think I'm supposed to go ahead and introduce the next video. The fight for freedom is not just for ourselves, but it is for our children. And even if you have not birthed a child, it does take a village to raise one. So we are all responsible for making sure that our children have every opportunity and every moment to be autonomous. And this next song talks about our children's responsibility as well as ours in raising them. It's called On Children.
Your children are not your children. They are the sons and the daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but they are not from you. Though they are with you, they belong not to you. You can give them your love, but not your thoughts. They have their own thoughts. They have their own thoughts. You can house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the place of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You can try to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you. Strive to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you. Ooh, your children are not your children. They are the sons and the daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but they are not from you. Though they are with you, they belong not to you. You can give them your love, but not your thoughts. They have their own thoughts. They have their own thoughts. You can house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the place of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You can try to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you. Strive to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you.
So that is a Sweet Honey in the Rock song, again, with myself, Richelle Claiborne, and my cousin T. Ames.
Mute myself. So I just wanted to say a couple of words to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is without question not how we usually do these things. Usually our Juneteenth event is a 2-day event where the first day we thank our ancestors, and then on the second day we are out in the green area of the Jefferson School celebrating our freedom. So being at home in my office, talking to all of you when I really want to be out hugging and loving on all of you as we usually do, and feeling the joy of this particular day. As we start to sort of think about where we stand today, hearing that the governor had declared Juneteenth a holiday, for me was a heartening thing. But I think as we begin to put together the conversation that we heard earlier with that idea, it becomes even more important that we celebrate Juneteenth. As Mr. Gibbs has said, it becomes even more important that we orient ourselves towards truth, that we understand that as the history of Black people in this country, as they have sought their freedom and trust from the minute Black people have landed on this country, on this land, they have sought their freedom, that as their efforts go, so do our efforts go. That the freedoms that African American people have been able to acquire for themselves are freedoms that we all now enjoy today. And so as we think about Juneteenth, I think that we really need to be oriented in that direction. Someone asked a question about schools. We at the Heritage Center just finished a week-long course with 20 Charlottesville, Albemarle County, and Central Virginia teachers, what we called embracing our narrative. And we called it embracing our narrative because we're not interested in changing the narrative. We're not interested in rearranging the narrative. We are interested in all of us understanding the truth of what this country is and who we all are together as we progress towards this experiment in democracy. But from the point of view of our embracing our narrative, we charge those teachers with the possibility of teaching American history through the lens of Black people. And so we, over the course of that week, both local historians and academic historians began to describe enslavement not as a condition of being enslaved, but as a condition of Black people, recognizing that there were free Blacks, recognizing that African American people fought for their freedoms and were very active in that fight. Thinking about something as important as massive resistance, rather than talking about it as something that was forced on Black people without their ability to fight against it, more about the long 1939 activity of the NAACP that forced massive resistance, in effect, through their activities to tear down Jim Crow. So I think as we leave today and walk away from our screens and think differently about Juneteenth, is that we really have to understand that what's going on in the streets, what is being demanded by young Black people, is what has always happened in this country, that we demand and expect the rights to be free and live as free people. So I think that's what I want to leave you with. I think that we at the Heritage Center, if I were to describe my mission, that is my mission, to make sure that we lift up the voices of Black people, that we provide for this community a clear understanding of that history, so that we're all engaging in a exercise of truth. So again, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over again to Richelle to bring us out to the end of this. And next year, we'll be outside doing our thing. So see you then.
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. We look forward to it. To be young, gifted, and Black. Oh, what a lovely, precious dream. To be young, gifted, and Black. Open your heart to what I mean. In the whole world, you know, there are a billion boys and girls who are young, gifted, and Black, and that's a fact. Young, gifted, and Black, we must begin to tell our young. There's a world waiting for you. This is a quest that's just begun. When you feel really low, yes, there's a truth you should know. When you're young, gifted, and Black, your soul's intact. Young, gifted, and Black, oh, how I long to know the truth. There are times when I look back and I am haunted by my youth. Oh, but my joy of today is that we can all be proud to say that we're young, gifted, and Black, and that's where it's at, that we're young, gifted, and Black, and that's where it's at. Thank you.
I say one last thing before we go. We would be remiss without thanking Auntie Maxine for all her hard work. This should have been our 20th anniversary. Instead, we're doing Juneteenth, COVID-19. So we're holding off on the 20th anniversary so we can do this all together. Maxine Holland has been our guidepost through all of this, and without being able to end with her and honoring her as the last thing we do before we leave, we would be remiss. So this is my applause to her and my applause to all of you. Thank you. Have a good night.